Welcome everybody to 3 Count Commentaries. This is Autopsy, the last hours of Andy Kaufman. For those of you who have not been paying attention to this series, it is a review of sorts or notes from an episode of Autopsy that features pro wrestlers. And hey, Andy Kaufman fits the bill. Dr. Michael Hunter is a forensic pathologist. He is sort of the main character of the autopsy shows as he looks at the cause of death of a celebrity. I typically feature pro wrestlers. And in that time, he tries to figure out what could have caused the illness or ailment that killed them. In this instance, Andy Kaufman died of primary bronchiogenic carcinoma, aka lung cancer. And the episode was built around two things. One was Andy Kaufman's death. Two, the idea that Andy Kaufman maybe had faked his death because him and his friends, or his friend Bob Zmuda, discussed that Andy Kaufman would one day fake his death. In the end, of course, everybody realized that Andy Kaufman really did die, so that's kind of a spoiler for the second one. But a little biographical information. Andy Kaufman was born January 17th, 1949. He died May 16th, 1984. His father was a jeweler. His mom was a housewife. He was the oldest of three, born in upstate New York. He was described as a natural entertainer, loved Elvis Presley, became a fan of pro wrestling very early in his life. Actually attended many shows in Madison Square Garden, which we'll actually get into later. In 1975, he made his way to Saturday Night Live when he did his Mighty Mouse routine. In 1978, he ended up on the hit TV show Taxi. Andy had spent his childhood writing short stories and poems, and he was actually more of a fan of improv than actual television, because improv was what got him the spot on Saturday Night Live. His love of improv played into his obsession with pro wrestling. In 1979, Andy Kaufman actually begins his foray into pro wrestling as the intergender champion of the world. This would go on for several years, of course, leading to the infamous feud with Jerry the King Lawler in Memphis in 1982. The feud was ongoing until Andy Kaufman was diagnosed with lung cancer and could no longer physically continue. Alright, so let's get into some of the medical stuff that they discussed in the episode of Autopsy. One of the things is that Andy Kaufman had actually been diagnosed with OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, and it affected his way of life. One of the things was he needed to eat 7 almonds a day. He was also quite irritable in how if little things were done wrong, he would get very upset about them. So everything had to be essentially pre-planned, and then he had to go according to plan. He attributed his OCD to the death of his grandfather, as when his grandfather died, he believed that his grandfather was going to come back, so he would sit and wait for him. Outside of that, the only other serious medical issues was that in 1978, Andy Kaufman was diagnosed with hepatitis. Now, this is a specific kind of hepatitis because it was not mentioned what kind of hepatitis he had contracted. Dr. Michael Hunter says that it was most likely hepatitis A because everyone who said that Andy had it, they said, well, he had the kind that you get from shellfish, and that kind of weans it down to that. But they also kind of thought that maybe the hepatitis is one of the causes of his lung cancer. But he had hepatitis of the liver, of course. Now, this, of course, was ruled out. It was thrown out. Also, the idea that Andy Kaufman had AIDS was also posited in this episode because there's some belief that Andy Kaufman might have been bisexual and that he quite frequently visited prostitutes. These sort of out of the ordinary ideas started to populate because Andy Kaufman was only 35 years old, had no history of doing any type of hard drugs outside of his teen years where he smoked cigarettes and did some speed and some LSD, but none of these things are connected to cancer, according to Dr. Michael Hunter. And these things were when he was a teenager. But for his entire adult life, he was a vegetarian, non-smoker, who was very focused on his physical health. And the only vice that Andy Kaufman had outside of the prostitutes was his love of ice cream. And Andy's friends would state that Andy Kaufman would, quite frankly, he would get mad and believing that he got lung cancer from excessive amounts of sugar because he loved ice cream. Dr. Michael Hunter, of course, said that, well, diabetes can contribute to lung cancer, but Andy Kaufman, of course, did not have diabetes. But this goes into sort of his state of mind, where Andy Kaufman had OCD. He had, these weird beliefs in where he thought that the sugar was giving him cancer, and he wouldn't eat meat and all this sort of stuff. But his biggest issue was that he refused traditional medical treatment. In lieu of chemotherapy or radiation, Andy Kaufman wanted to try a microbiotic diet and a positive mental attitude. He was a lifelong meditator as a person who believed in transcendental meditation. So he thought he could heal himself from the cancer, and of course it only made it worse. Now, there was an interesting question I was asked, because Andy Kaufman didn't just perform as himself, he also performed as Tony Clifton, the irritable lounge singer character that he liked to play. And Tony Clifton often smoked, but the character, the various people in the documentary, his friends and such, said that he always lit a cigarette, but he never actually smoked it. He never inhaled it. So he would put it up to his lips, but he would actually never inhale the cigarette. So they were still trying to figure out, why did he even get cancer? And he is, of course, resistant to medications. And it wasn't till near the very end, once it had gotten to the point of basically being inoperable, that he decided to try the chemotherapy and the radiation. Before it had gotten that bad, however, Michael Hunter wanted to look into some of the falls that Andy Kaufman had taken in the wrestling ring to see if any of those could have possibly damaged his lungs. Of course, they focused on the power driver that he took from Jerry the King Lawler and not the backdrop, which actually could have done more damage to his lungs. But of course, the wrestling didn't do it. He wasn't a smoker, and he had not done any hard drugs, and it certainly wasn't his diet. So the question of how did he end up with lung cancer continued to evade them. While they are discussing how did he manage to get cancer, he's also evading treatment. So he stops his treatment for 6 weeks as he flies to the Philippines to try this alternative medicine. He goes to some kind of psychic surgeon in the Philippines. He was there for 6 weeks. This is where they apparently remove tumors from the body without actually causing, real surgeries. And he believed he was cured. And one of his friends in the episode said that Andy Kaufman was like a big kid, and he was very naive. And he truly believed that he had been cured by this psychic surgeon of his lung cancer. But because he had stopped his treatment for 6 weeks, he actually got much worse. It was a mixture of the placebo effect of him believing that the psychic surgeon had worked, along with the radiation and the chemo that actually was making him feel better. But he had stopped the radiation and the chemo in order to go to see the psychic surgeon, so he actually got worse. On May 14th, 1984, Andy Kaufman ended up checking himself into the hospital. His kidneys had failed, his other organs were failing, and he would never return home. On May 16th, he was mostly unconscious until his kidneys failed and he passed away. Ultimately, how and why Andy Kaufman ended up with lung cancer remains mostly a mystery. Dr. Michael Hunter, the best he was able to give is that it was probably genetic, due to his mother and his grandfather also having cancer, and that he probably had a weakened immunity to lung cancer. But there is no solid reason to explain why Andy Kaufman, at 35 years old, has a history of being a vegetarian and a non-smoker and not doing anything in terms of drugs or alcohol, or being in any type of serious damage or having any other co-occurring medical conditions, died of lung cancer. It's quite frankly one of the scariest things that I've ever really experienced, because everybody tries to tie things to an if-then statement. if you do this, then this will happen. So if you eat lots of snacks, then you will be fat, then you will get diabetes, then you will have health issues. But he didn't do that. So it wasn't that if you smoke, you will get lung cancer. That didn't happen here. If you damage the insides of your body somehow, you will get various types of cancers. That didn't happen. So it was a complete mystery how this guy who was fit and focused on his health managed to get lung cancer. But how he got it is less relevant to the fact that he didn't treat it for a really long time. He continued to work. He continued to wrestle. He continued to avoid treatment. And he did so until he physically had no choice but to get into the chemo and radiation. And by that point in time, it was too late. As I mentioned earlier, Andy Kaufman was a lifelong wrestling fan. He had attended several shows at Madison Square Garden. One of the shows that he attended that made him want to be a wrestler was May the 17th, 1963. It was the Nature Boy Buddy Rogers versus Bruno Sammartino title switch. Andy Kaufman was one of 19,648 people that attended that show. Of the 7 Madison Square Garden cards that Andy Kaufman attended between 1963 and 1974, every single one of them had Bruno Sammartino in the main event. He was a huge Bruno Sammartino fan. Of course, Andy himself began wrestling in 1979, started wrestling women for a shoot, offering them money if they could beat him, and gaining a lot of attention as the intergender champion of the world. He had done shows in Cobo Arena in Detroit, and he had even done a show in Atlantic City, Nevada, which was highlighted in Playboy magazine in February of 1982. He wrestled a young lady by the name of Susan Smith, who was a Playboy playmate, and she was Miss September. He actually wrestled in 1981 at Playboy's Atlantic City Hotel and Casino. They only drew 600 fans, but at $7.50 per ticket, they did okay. Andy weighed in at 161 pounds, while Susan weighed in at 138 pounds. Larry Sharp, who of course would go on later to open the Monster Factory, he was the referee for this match. And Andy Kaufman had claimed that he had been trained by Nature Boy Buddy Rogers for this contest. Susan Smith was trained by a high school wrestling coach by the name of Jim Steffen. Allegedly, Playboy actually filmed the match for their Playboy channel, but I have not been able to find any footage of it. Of course, Andy won this match. He did so by having Larry Sharp slow count when the woman had control and fast count when he had control. This led to, of course, a very funny back and forth in Playboy magazine where the woman claimed she had beat him. But this actually plays into a lot of what we learned about Andy Kaufman later in life, is that he wrestled mostly women who were in the adult entertainment industry, and he liked prostitutes. So that's an interesting thing that, is not always talked about or discussed, is the kinds of women that would be involved in these sort of staged wrestling performances with Andy Kaufman. Of course, the wrestling, not only the wrestling of the women, but some of the things he said that were misogynistic on purpose is what, did a lot of damage to his career. And Andy was known mostly as being sort of what they call a con man, or they said that he might have been anti-entertainment, that he actually enjoyed subverting people's expectations, which is why there was such a wide belief that he had actually faked having lung cancer and faked his death. There have been many documentaries and movies done about Andy since he passed away, but one of the documentaries that is still floating around on YouTube is called I'm From Hollywood, which of course goes through his entire feud with Jerry the King Lawler. If you actually watch that, you could see Andy visibly coughing in some of the promo segments, which of course is the indication that he was battling lung cancer at that time. So there was a lot going on here, but they still couldn't figure out why this guy had gotten lung cancer. And they pretty much just wrapped it up to his genetics. But, Andy Kaufman is a very interesting wrestling figure. Because he was in it for 3 years, a little over 3 years, but was extremely popular. And there had been many. There was a movie, Man on the Moon, featuring Jim Carrey, that was about his time as a pro wrestler, that featured largely a lot of his wrestling stuff. Of course, Tales from the Territories, a most recent Vice documentary where Jerry the King Lawler discussed it, and WWE talks about it almost constantly, his time as a pro wrestler. So if you don't think Andy Kaufman fits on this channel, you're wrong. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.